Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next podcast in this series exploring sexuality in the Bible. And today I am super excited to be joined by a scholar whose work has helped me so much in understanding how exactly the word homosexuality ended up in our English Bibles, Dr. Heather White. So, Dr. White, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
It's good to be here.
Yes. And as I said, you've done so much work on this particular topic, looking at particularly how Protestants have kind of turned homosexuality into this horrendous sin in the modern era. And before we dive into homosexuality in the Bible, the broad question I just want to start with is there any pure Bible translation out there? A translation without bias that communicates the meaning of the original authors? Is that something we can actually have access to?
I'm going to say no. And I think it goes, one of the things that I do with my students is I really emphasize that when we call something the Bible, what we're really going after is an idea that sort of exists in a sort of little bubble over the actual Bibles that we have access to. And that whole process of how Bibles are created. It involves a process of translation, and translation is itself not just a facilitation of meaning, but also an invention of meaning, because the people who are making those translations are deciding how to interpret things that can be debated. And then they're translating texts that were compiled together through a long historical process. One simple way to convey the complexity of that is to emphasize that Protestants, Christians, and Jews do not share a Bible, even though we think of Bibles as conveying a Judeo-Protestant tradition, or a Judeo-Christian tradition is what I meant to say. And we don't read a single Bible. We have different texts that we read. And with Christians and Jews, that difference is even more emphasized because Jews read the Hebrew Bible. Christians call that same version, a version of that text, the Old Testament, right? So we're not reading the same text. These texts have been created by different people over time, and translation itself is a process of interpretation. So if anything, I think the hope is in reading with a community that works to read to, if the Bible isn't the source of something true, pure is problematic, but at the very least, we can read in community where our ideas about the text have an opportunity to be checked by people who have different interpretations. And that process itself can be contentious, but I think it's probably the one hope we have of getting to some sort of meaning that isn't just a mirror that just filters back our own biases.
Totally. And one more question on that, because I'm imagining folks might be hearing that, and if they come from a more evangelical Protestant tradition that holds this very high view of biblical authority, in fact, believing that all of our theology and all of our faith and practice needs to emerge from the Bible, if there's no way to actually get to the authorial intent, is there a way to, or why should we, I should say, trust the Bibles that we have, any particular version of the Bible? If there's an answer to that question.
Well, the versions that we have give us ways of asking questions, and ways of asking questions in community. And I think it's probably because I grew up evangelical, because I grew up with a strong sense that the Bible is the source of authority, that I'm all the more horrified, right, by the way that translations stand in for the word itself. So if the word is really hard to get to, right, something called the Word of God, if that is hard to get to, it's important that we know that we don't find that on the surface of the text that we have access to. And the idea that those are that those surface level texts, that the words on the page actually get us there, I think is, we can talk about idolatry there, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Totally. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And one place, obviously, this becomes really clear, and I do recommend anybody listening to go read one of your many works on this particular topic. the way that homosexuality begins appearing in English Bibles is a completely modern phenomenon. And there's been a lot of buzz, I'm sure you've seen. In the past year, there's been a documentary called 1946 that has emerged. So that year has been in a lot of conversation. And your work has talked about this for a while now, that the Translation Committee of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible places the word homosexuality in the English biblical text for the first time in 1946. And there's so many questions that I want to ask around that. But one of the first ones that's most surprising in reading your work is that you highlighted that it's actually liberal Bible translators, people that have a more what we would call progressive theological approach, that end up placing the word homosexuality in the Bible and thus causing a lot of damage over the next however many decades to LGBT people. Can you give us a little insight to what happened with the Revised Standard Version Committee and how they chose the word homosexuality for arsenic vitae?
Yeah. Um, I can talk more about the cultural process than the specifics of who was in the room. I mean, the simplest way to characterize what happened is that these groups of theological and religious elites, meaning that these were professors at divinity schools and seminaries who were reading Freud, reading Havelock Ellis, reading the medical research on sexuality coming from the fields of psychology and psychiatry, as that field was becoming established as a medical way of understanding how human desire and human relationships work. So these folks who were also working as professors and scholars of the New Testament were reading this literature coming out of the psychoanalytic and psychological fields and asking questions about how to understand human sexuality as a result of that engagement. And that engagement was so much part of the ether of of how to make sense of human beings, right? At the beginning of the 20th century, that it wasn't that they were deliberately saying we need to insert Freud into our text. It was that their understanding of human sexuality was being shaped by that set of inquiries. And it was out of that engagement with that science that they began to read the Bible in new ways. And in the process of reading it in new ways, had different understandings of what the text meant. And the process of translation is a process of choosing words that establish those meanings. And it, from that framework, that was the word that made sense to them.
Totally. Not that you, as you said, we can't get into the minds per se of the people who chose that word, but it is quite interesting. And it shows something about the process of translation throughout the ages that most scholars know that the ancient world didn't have a concept of sexual orientation in the way that we do. Mm-hmm. And so while it is true, as you said, like there was this new emerging literature, and I think in some senses, the more we learn about humanity, it does call us to go back to ancient texts and kind of try to understand what they're getting at. Mm-hmm. But there was no concept of sexual orientation. So do you think it was a good translation move for them to import sexual orientation into the minds of an ancient author? And yeah, I'll just leave that there for.
Yeah. Well, what I think it's important to say here about the process of translation is the most recent English translation that they were navigating or comparing their ideas to the most was the King James Version of the Bible, which was written during the age of Shakespeare, which also didn't have a sense of sexual orientation. So this notion of homosexuality and heterosexuality is also not represented when we go look at the translation that was the most popular English translation of the Bible until probably the 1970s or 80s sometime. I'm not sure about the exact date for when a newer translation, the New International Version, surpassed the King James Version in its sales. But what we find in the King James Version is a slightly different interpretation of those texts, and it also wasn't awesome. It talked about sodomites. It had directly negative things to say about slavery and enslaved people, and had quite a number of things that those liberal scholars wanted to question and challenge in what they were putting in as a updated modern translation. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't think that homosexual was a good choice for a word, but they were also attempting to improve something that was already quite flawed.
Totally. And you brought up this word sodomy, and you have a whole book about Protestants and the use of this word. And in the study that I've done, it's pretty interesting to see how that particular concept evolves
Yeah.
from when its earliest usage had nothing really to do with homosexuality to towards the Middle Ages and in the King James Version, even while it's not homosexual in particular, it does begin to take on sexual connotations, sexual deviancy, prostitution, all sorts of things. Can you talk a little bit about sodomy and how that word evolved and also kind of went out of fashion post 1946?
Yeah. Sodomy is a really funny word to investigate because it has meant so many different things over time. And I think in my answer, what I would give is places to look to see how that process of change has happened. One of the people whose work has guided me in thinking about the earliest context when sodomy was coined as a Latin word is the scholar Mark Jordan, who writes about the invention of sodomy in Christian theology and works to make sense of how is it that that word got sort of invented in the first place and what were the contexts for that. And he is working from 9th century Christian theological texts in Europe, and a whole set of questions that look really unfamiliar today, right? Which would not be things that we're not debating many of the things that were up for question when that term was first invented. But I mean, just the invention of that word also didn't end the possibilities for its meaning. So another place that I've looked to understand the meanings of sodomy and the meanings of the sodomite is in Shakespearean era England, to see what were the preconceptions of the scholars who were translating the King James Version of the Bible. When a lot of what sodomy and sodomites meant took up the debates and the political intrigue and that political. It's hard to overstate exactly how difficult the controversies between the Church of England as a Protestant leaning church versus the Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholic Church anchored in Rome. So that's to say, among the many things that were happening during that era, the people who died, the people who were killed, the wars that were fought, right? One of the things that word meant was whoever the bastards were on the other side, which is forgive the word, but it was a slander for a reason. It was a slander because many of the Protestant perceptions of Roman Catholicism was that they were perverts, that they had turned theology upside down, that they were practicing an abomination. And we don't think of, Protestant versus Roman Catholic controversies in those terms today, but that was part of the political uptake for the term of sodomy, which then, I could continue, which then gets cast into new meanings again in the European voyages of discovery and the settle and the colonization of formerly of the colonized worlds, right? So they were perceiving native peoples and non-European peoples as also sodomites, and saw them through this framework as being an abomination, as being perverts, as having monstrous bodies. And sodomy and sodomites took up those meanings as well. So that's to say, it's really hard to sort of distill a sense of same-sex love or same-sex sex from all of the different ideas of monstrosity, perversity, like upturned, sort of inverted or abominable understandings of religion. Like all of those different fields of meaning are packed into those words. So it takes up histories of racism and native expropriation and all of this in its history of being interpreted by Christians.
Totally. I think you're right. This particular term is super interesting for anybody interested in actually studying because it shows how fickle language is and how it changes so rapidly throughout the centuries to mean so many different things. Um, One of the other things that you highlight that's disturbing to read, frankly, is post 1946, you have what we can assume are well meaning scholars trying to produce an updated edition of the Bible. They use the word homosexuality for First Corinthians, arsenokoitai. And then quickly afterwards, this word starts appearing in evangelical translations and virtually all other English translations. But as that's happening, you highlight that there are political shifts that are happening, particularly in American Christianity. There's the rise of the religious right that begins to emerge a little bit later on, and there becomes political motivations, it appears, for the use of this word and the way that homosexuality is used as a biblical text. And you even do a lot of research into like study Bibles that begin emerging around that period. Can you talk a little bit about why this liberal Bible translation, so to speak, becomes the basis for conservative Bible translations and how the word homosexual becomes a political tool for conservative Christians in America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in many ways, what I followed in my research was how more conservative leaning wings of, or moderate even leaning wings of the mainline Protestant denominations began to follow the same pathway as their more progressive or liberal co-religionists. So that's to say, like defining mainline Protestantism is another problem or another question, right? Because there are a whole set of different denominations that in various ways are understood sociologically as sort of forming the core of American life in their influence, their shaping influence over American culture. So this is how we get the idea of the Protestant mainline. But of course, each of those denominations spans quite a wide sort of political, theological, socioeconomic span of people. And one of the things that the word homosexuality sort of tracks along is a set of divisions that were taking place across mainline Protestant denominations, where progressives or liberals were asking new questions of their biblical texts, were following and interested in things like psychology and their interpretations of human sexuality. And initially, some of those developments were challenged and resisted by their more conservative other members of the same denominations. But over time, many of those more conservative leaning folks also began asking similar questions because those questions became difficult not to ask. Like, is heterosexuality something that is natural to human beings? And if we're asking that question, what exactly is heterosexuality? So one of the chapters in my book looks at how heterosexuality became to be understood as natural and normal and even God-given by members of conservative Christians who initially resisted the way that their liberal co-religionists were so focused on sex as part of the human psyche. So once they started to sort of adopt some of those same psychological and psychoanalytic assumptions about human sexuality, they began to ask the same questions. And because of their more conservative bent, began to respond to those questions with different arguments about what was true, about what the Bible said. But again, the questions themselves required interpreting the Bible in new ways because those questions were not part of the text prior to that moment, right? Or prior to those questions being asked. So ultimately, sort of this is a bit of a gloss of that history, but ultimately the same psychoanalytic interpretations that influenced liberals also came to shape the way that conservatives understood their Bibles as well. And what they did even more adamantly was to insist that homosexuality was unnatural and that heterosexuality, in contrast, was something that had been created by God in the very beginning.
Yeah, I want to just highlight what you just said again. Like, homosexuality was new in 1946 in the Bible, but heterosexuality was never an assumed, at least the way we construe heterosexuality was not assumed up until that period of history. And so it's so interesting from that historical framework to look back and see just how theology and ethics really did shift for both conservatives and liberals broadly, to adapt to new knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But we took them in two different directions. And I think it's very interesting that we're having this conversation when we're having it, because from the lineage of the Revised Standard Version came the New Revised Standard Version. And then this year came the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, which, from what I can tell, am I looking at it, is one of the first, there's a few others, but one of the first major Bible translations to take out homosexuality. This Bible translation that emerges from that same 1946 translation, loosely at least, has removed homosexuality, removed that kind of language. And even things like the SBL Study Bible, which just released a couple months ago, has complete new footnotes and call-out boxes around arsenokoitai and malakoi, saying the traditional translation, meaning 1946 onward, is no longer assumed by scholars to be the actual best understanding of these words. I just wonder if you can comment a little bit about, like, from then till now, the impact of these translations changing, and if you think the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, that's a mouthful, will have an impact on English Bible translations going forward.
Yeah, like the question about will this new translation that removes direct reference to homosexuality, will it have an impact? I mean, the sad thing of this history is that because people regard homosexuality as something that is intrinsically in the text, or when I say people, I should say so many people have had ideas about the Bible shaped by this history of translation that is itself radically new. And their assumption from this, like, late 20th century history onward, is that the Bible, of course, condemns homosexuality, and any effort to so-called remove homosexuality from the text is an innovation, right? And what so many of them don't realize is how much that the innovation, the tradition is the innovation. That if they were, one of the things I often do is to encourage more people to look at the King James Version of the text, because that was the tradition prior to the conversations about what the Bible had to say about homosexuality. And it is bewildering to make sense of what the King James Version has to say about sexuality in general. There's so much in that translation that does not make sense. That is more readily the tradition, and not one that I want to go back to, but also one that I think should establish the innovation of asking questions of what the Bible has to say about homosexuality, about transgender identity, that the past is actually way more complicated than our translations allow it to be.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I've gotten to do, I'm in a PhD program in Bible, and a few months ago, we got to pull out a lot of these older texts from different languages, German texts, the Luther Bible, and some Latin texts and things like that. And it gets even more complicated the further back you go, from Luther kind of being the first to innovate, the language of arsenokoitai being boy lover, pedophilia kind of thing, which is still somewhat of a common argument in conversation still, but like, each stage of this, there's this new understanding, a new interpretation of these words, and it does have such a major impact. I just wonder, from the position of a historian, can you imagine a future where we undo the harm of the clobber passages? Do you really think that there's a way that the Bible translations will all catch up, and evangelical translations and Catholic translations will actually undo this psychological stigmatizing of homosexuality? Or does that just feel like probably not in our lifetime will we see something like that happen?
I mean, I think we will see that in different spaces, and I think we already see that in many. There are communities of faith that have taken up Bibles um, as a text for imagination, right? And as a text for especially imagining what God's work and God's will in the world could be today, right? With with an open question mark around that, and with an emphasis on healing and doing justice as what that work should be, right? And I am often so moved by the way that those communities um, hear and resonate with, like, sort of proclaim biblical text, and thinking of proclamation as the way of engaging those texts is a really interesting way to do it, right? What do biblical texts sound like in community, right? So there's also a different way, more imaginative way of engaging with those texts, and not an assumption that the words on the page tell us, right, in their black and white quality, how to be and what to do, and that we therefore have to silence any questions about harm and about justice in order to follow their dictates. So I think it's a hard history to challenge, because there have been at so many levels political efforts to manage and to fix the meanings of these texts, with a lot invested in authoritarian narratives telling us what they mean. So one of the things that has to be challenged is not only the words on the page, but also the way that communities engage with these texts and imagine their connection and their flourishing right around them. So we need more artists. We need more, all kinds of things to be able to, poets, right? Musicians, to think and engage with these multiple Bibles in different ways.
Yeah. I love you said this from the very beginning of our conversation. I just want to reiterate it, that the Bible has always, I know that's from a historical perspective, don't critique me for saying that, but the Bible has always, at some level, been a communal text. And from the Hebrew Bible, and the way, especially, I've learned a lot from being a part of a queer Jewish community here in New York City, just kind of listening into how they're engaging with these texts. And largely, the Jewish tradition has always understood the Bible to be a communal text with layers of meaning and different ways to wrestle with what the scripture says. And it can say some different things to different people in different contexts. And so that's why community is so important. And this isn't a divine book dropped from the sky that has one meaning for all time, but it is a book of evolving meaning. And that seems to be kind of the point. And that's where liberation comes from. That's where hope for any new community that's trying to engage with this text comes from. And I think that's such a beautiful way to articulate it. And I know you're doing that from such a historical lens, that this is how the Bible has been engaged by a lot of people over lots of years.
Mm.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you an unfair question. Final question. It's going to be strictly theological, but from where you sit, it seems clear that you don't think the word homosexual should be in the Bible for arsenokoitai and malakoi. How do you, from the best of your understanding, understand what Paul is getting at when he's using those words?
I truly don't know. And I don't know that, I mean, I'm also not a person who thinks that if we were to decide if we were to somehow be able to teleport into Paul's consciousness and know for sure what it was that Paul meant, I don't know that that would solve it. I don't, because I don't know that, well, I mean, yeah, biblical scholars question even if there was Paul and if Paul was the author. But say he was, and let's say we could teleport into his consciousness, I don't know that that would solve it. Because here again, we're relying on one person's understanding situated in context as to who and who should not be admitted into the kingdom of God. But ultimately, I mean, I guess for Christians, ultimately God decides that, right?
Yeah.
Or perhaps truly Christian communities decide that.
Totally.
So I don't know that that will solve it, even if we were able to definitively know the answer.
Totally. It's such a helpful answer. And I think, again, the invitation that your work continually brings up is, and I think all history at its best is this, that there are no definitive answers on a lot of these things. And as much, I've always said that the conversations around the 6 verses in the Bible that people assume to be about homosexuality isn't actually the problem. The problem is how we understand what the Bible is, how we understand the nature of our Christian faith. And again, you rerooting it in community and saying it's up to the community to wrestle with this and wrestle with our conscience and our tradition and figure out what is true for us. As uncomfortable as that is for so many of us coming from an evangelical tradition where we have been taught there is one truth, it's such a helpful way to think. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for all of your work. To everybody who's watching your book, Reforming Sodom, incredible history of Protestants grappling with the question of homosexuality and sexuality largely. Thank you for taking some time to help wrestle with these issues, and such an honor to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.